I'm Baron Reed, Professor of Philosophy and Deputy Director at the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Our mission at Northwestern Buffett Institute is to foster meaningful engagement across borders of all kinds. We're here today to celebrate the publication of a powerful new book, Electrifying Indonesia by Anto Mohsin, who will be in conversation with Dr. Julie Cohn and Dr. Suzanne Moon. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks to all of our audience here at Northwestern Buffett and online. We will reserve some time after our initial discussion for some questions. For those tuning in virtually, I encourage you to submit any questions that come to mind today via the chat box, and those conversations will then be added to our discussion. Anto Mohsin is an assistant professor in residence in the liberal arts program at Northwestern University in Qatar, an affiliated faculty member of the Science and Human Culture program at the Northwestern Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, and also a Northwestern Buffett Faculty Fellow. He's an interdisciplinary scholar of infrastructure, energy, and the environment, specializing in Indonesia in the 20th century with a broader interest in Southeast Asia. His next research project investigates the maintenance of energized power lines, exploring the intricate connection between the upkeep of socio-technical systems and the laborers responsible for its execution. Julie Cohn is a research historian in the Center for Public History at the University of Houston and a non-resident scholar at the Center for Energy Studies in Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Her work focuses on energy infrastructures, environmental history, technological change, and the relationships between government, business, and the public. Cohn's book, The Grid, Biography of American Technology, examines the history of electrification in North America, and especially the story of how and why power companies choose to interconnect. Current research focuses on development of the isolated Texas power grid, the stories of the power systems engineers who produce the algorithms we use to control our grids today, and how notions of reliability have changed over time. Suzanne Moon is the Lukas N. Walker Presidential Professor in the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. She studies the history of technology in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. Her book, Technology in Southeast Asian History, appeared in 2023 from Johns Hopkins University Press. She was awarded the 2021 Da Vinci Medal by the Society for the History of Technology for outstanding contributions to the history of technology. Her current research explores shifting ideas about the relationships between food security, social resilience, and agricultural technologies in response to climate change. So we will begin now with an introduction to the book from Anto, and then with comments from Julie and Suzanne following. We'll then close with a question and answer period with time for questions from the audience as well. Anto.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Baron, for the kind introduction. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank several people. My thanks go to Annalise Riles, Buffett's former executive director, Deborah Cohn, Buffett's current interim executive director, and Baron Reed, Buffett's deputy director, for inviting and supporting me to present my work today. I would also like to thank all the wonderful Buffett Institute staff for making my stay in Evanston enjoyable. To Dana, May, Madeline, Samantha, Harrington, Diana, and Grace in particular, thank you for your help organizing this event today. My thanks also go to Julie Cohn and Suzanne Moon, who have agreed to serve as discussants, and Baron Reed as moderator. It's really an honor to share this event and later the stage with you. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's so wonderful to see many familiar faces and also new ones, of course, in the audience. Now, perhaps you may wonder why research and wrote a book about a history of electrification in Indonesia. Shouldn't engineers or those who have worked in the power industry tackle such a seemingly technical subject? Well, I happen to have 2 engineering degrees and have also worked for a multinational energy company at one point. But it was my interdisciplinary training in graduate school in Science and Technology Studies, or STS, and my exposure to Southeast Asian studies literature over there that convinced me to pursue this topic as a serious research subject. Indonesia's electrical history is rich and complex, and examining the historical development of power systems in the country reveals some interesting insights about the Indonesian electric infrastructure, society, nation state, politics, and how all of these were connected to the idea of social justice, nation building, and national development. So in my new book, I delve into Indonesia's New Order period. That's between 1966 to 1998 under President Suharto, contending that the Suharto government strategically treated electricity as a public good and delivered it as a social service, not just to improve the socioeconomic well-being of citizens, but also to secure electoral and political support. The establishment of the state power company, in Indonesian is called Perusahaan Listrik Negara, or PLN for short, and the electrification schemes were aimed at fostering a patron-client relationship between the rulers and the ruled, making Indonesia's electric infrastructure development, I argue, was a patrimonial technopolitical project. Now, this involved PLN functioning both as a technical and social organization, supplying subsidized electricity and other social services to help maintain the new order's political legitimacy and ensure its longevity. Three key themes figured in Indonesia's electrification's endeavors: social justice, nation building, and national development. Let me now turn to discussing each of these three themes. First, electricity and social justice. When Indonesia declared independence in August 1945, several urban areas in the country had already been electrified. The Dutch private companies were responsible for bringing electricity to their colony in Southeast Asia as early as in 1897. First in Batavia, now the city is called Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, and then to other urban areas. Dutch generated electricity in colonial Indonesia, powered the machineries of various extractive industries and electric light bulbs, of course, and appliances in households, shops, factories, hotels, theaters, and building. I have an image here on the slide that shows the Sawah Lunto power plant that was constructed to deliver electricity to the Ombilin coal mines in West Sumatra, as an example of how electricity was used in the extractive industry. And here on the slides, you can see various places such as that Buyat Bakery, retirement house, hotel, theater, and even Pasar Malam, or a night market that was illuminated by electricity generated by these Dutch private companies. Now, even though electricity was available in urban areas, rural areas were largely neglected, as extending power lines there was deemed unprofitable by these Dutch private companies. Consequently, many natives had limited access to electricity, which was either unavailable or unaffordable. In the post-independence period, Indonesian nationalists and labor activists worked to nationalize all the Dutch private utility companies. After completing the nationalization effort in 1958, the Sukarno administration established a state power company. To them, state-led electrification was their answer to the social injustice that they saw and experienced during colonialism, where electricity was distributed unequally. The Suharto government continued the efforts to electrify many additional areas when it launched the Listrik Masuk Desa, or Electricity Entering the Villages program, in the late 1970s. PLN installed hundreds of diesel fuel power stations across Indonesia, and they've come to dot the Indonesian landscapes and maps. As you can see here, the red squares on these maps. This is a map of northern Sumatra and southern Sumatra. This is in southern Kalimantan, we call it, or Borneo. And here in the island of Maluku, or Moluccas, and southern Sulawesi. Many of these diesel fuel power stations dot the Indonesian landscapes. The Suharto government also constructed several large-scale power plants in Java and built the first sophisticated interconnected system linking 3 of the most populous islands, Java, Madura, and Bali. And the way that they link the regional power grids between Java and Madura and Java and Bali is using underwater cable. Decisions to extend electricity to rural areas in Indonesia, driven in part to serve the large population residing there, were also politically motivated to garner support for the government party Golkar in general elections. Because of this, politically insignificant and sparsely populated villages were also neglected. Furthermore, not all electrified villages receive essential complementary infrastructures such as roads and irrigation systems, schools, and markets, leading to unequal social impacts on those electrified areas. In some cases, electricity even exacerbated existing inequalities as affluent individuals were able to be connected to the grid, while others still face higher prices and continue to live without electricity. The New Order regime also established 3 independent rural electric cooperatives, or RECs, outside Java in 3 areas, Luwu in Sulawesi, Lombok, that's an island next to Bali, to the east of Bali, and Lampung in southern Sumatra, to expand rural electrification. Despite seemingly well-intentioned efforts and consistent support from the Suharto government led to the collapse of these RECs. Faced with increased demands and service challenges, their customers perceive prolonged power outages and higher electricity prices because they were paying electricity higher than PLN electricity. So they perceive that as unjust, expressing desire to get more affordable electricity that was provided by PLN. Second, electricity and nation building. Electricity played a significant role in Indonesia's nation-building efforts. The state power company's origin is officially traced back to the founding of the Office of Electricity and Gas on October 27, 1945, although the formal creations of PLN actually occurred in 1965. Recognizing the importance of this founding date, it is celebrated annually as the National Electricity Day in Indonesia. Having a dedicated day to celebrate everything electricity may seem odd, but Indonesia, it is one of many such holidays that build and reinforce national identity. One of the purposes of having national days is to remind citizens of the idea of an Indonesian nation and to habituate them into reproducing and maintaining the Indonesian nationhood. So back in 1960, on October 27, 1960, the 15th anniversary of what was then still called National Gas and Electricity Day, President Sukarno delivered a speech articulating his vision for the country, emphasizing the role of electricity in transforming Indonesia from a quote-unquote water-minded nation or agriculture nation to an quote-unquote electricity-minded nation or an industrials nation. Perhaps the most visible linkage between electricity and nation building during the Sukarno era was when new electrical installations were built to energize new facilities, including a hotel, a sports stadium, and a new Republic of Indonesia television station, as you can see here, for the purposes of hosting and broadcasting the 4th Asian Games in Jakarta in 1962. Many Indonesians from all walks of life celebrated this milestone as a new nation holding one of the world's biggest sporting events. The Suharto government also linked electricity with the idea of the Indonesian nation. It established an electric bureaucracy that spreads across the archipelago. PLN employees, especially the most talented and promising ones, were assigned rotations in areas other than the ones they were from to instill a sense of national unity. Additionally, the state power company did not just generate, transmit, and sell electricity to the masses, but also serve as a conduit of the state ideology Pancasila, that's Sanskrit for 5 principles. PLN employees were mandated to take Pancasila courses and on many occasions invoke Pancasila to talk about electrification policies and project excitedly. In this way, PLN helped transmit the state ideology to the citizenry who kept hearing the oft-repeated national goal of establishing Indonesia as quote-unquote just and prosperous Pancasila nation. Third, Pancasila, electricity and national development. The New Order regime used development to justify its rule. Development, the government said, would bring many material benefits to the populace, and electricity was one of them. Bringing electricity to the rural areas, it was claimed, was to improve villages so they all become self-sufficient, or swasembada in Indonesian, villages by the year 2000. Despite being pitched as a project to boost the well-being of villagers, Suharto's program also had another role. So not just to elevate villagers' lives, but also, as I mentioned earlier, to secure votes from citizens during the general elections. The Suharto government electrified thousands of villages during its time. As elections loomed, they rolled out grand inauguration ceremonies for village electrification, aiming to sway votes in favor of the government party Golkar by sending cabinet ministers to officiate the village electrification inauguration ceremonies, which were attended by thousands of villagers. Here, you can see several images I put on one slide of those village inauguration ceremonies, and in each occasion, there's a banner put up to mark the occasion. And one of them at the top left corner of the slide, lower left-hand corner it says, "Terima kasih Bapak Menteri Listrik sudah menyala," or "Thank you, Mr. Minister, for turning on the electricity." Thanking the Environment and Forestry Minister Emil Salim, who came to the village of Motoling in North Sulawesi to inaugurate 39 new electrified villages. Thousands of villagers came to associate the New Order government with a regime that gave them electricity and other material benefits. Here's another image of one lucky electricity customer receiving a free television set in a January 1987 village inauguration ceremony. But it wasn't just electricity and its highly subsidized prices that were made available to the population. PLN was developed to channel government's largesse in the form of educational scholarships, loans, and donations of many kinds to PLN employees, their dependents, people, and businesses in the rural areas. So consequently, many voted for Golkar in the general elections, which ensured that the parliament would be filled with government's loyal supporters. President Suharto kept getting reappointed until 1997, indicating that the strategies worked and helped the New Order regime lasted for 32 years. Reflecting on Indonesia's electrification journey yields a mosaic of outcomes. When the New Order regime fell in 1998, PLN had undergone a transformation into a semi-private entity, successfully establishing the infrastructure to electrify major cities and most district capitals, illuminating about 70% of the nation's villages. However, despite this progress, numerous villages still lingered in the shadows, detached from both electrical and political power. Imbalance of electrical coverage still exists within an island or between islands, even within one electrified villages. Nevertheless, the pursuit of social justice, the dream of fostering quote-unquote just and prosperous society based on Pancasila, and the nation-building efforts through electricity continue to inspire PLN employees and many others well beyond the downfall of the Suharto government. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anto. Julie?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to talk with you about Anto's book. Where did Anto go? Oh. Anto, you've done a masterful job of weaving together multiple themes in history of electrification and history of technology, and you've given us something new to ponder. Anto has offered us 3 interventions that should be very useful for additional research and, interestingly, for thinking about our electrical future. I'll provide a little bit of background on history of electrification, and I'm not an engineer, just getting it out there, to explain why things like a second interconnected system, patrimonial technopolitics, and what I see as the ingenuity of Indonesia's approach matter to historians. And throughout, I'll ask all of us to consider, and perhaps Anto to help us think through, how the story of electrifying Indonesia is particularly compelling for a transition to a low emission or a zero emission future. Thomas Hughes published what we consider the seminal work in history of electrification, called Networks of Power, in 1983. Anto references this book in his introduction, explaining that he employs Hughes's socio-technical systems approach. In Networks of Power, Hughes sets out to describe and perhaps codify how large-scale technological systems come into being. He uses 3 case studies in Germany, England, and the United States, and examines electrification in each from 1880 to 1930. Oops. He lays out a theory of technical evolution, from the inventor's workbench to the system's own internally sustained momentum for expansion. And he explains that the technological system is composed not only of the physical bits and pieces of generators, power lines, and so on, but also of intangible elements such as academic programs, economic settings, and government structures. In short, it is a socio-technical system. Importantly, Hughes's central focus remains on the physical infrastructure, and in the case of electrification, one in which the operation of one component will influence the operation of the entire system. Following Hughes, historians continue to explore the meaning, effects, and usages of large-scale physical power networks, especially in North America and Europe. Even social historians who focused on society's response to electrification built their stories around the physical power networks. In more recent years, scholars have focused outside North America and Europe, addressing the development of interconnected grids and the social tensions around how they are built, operated, and used, and others examining individuals and communities that are essentially off the grid, whether for geographic or economic or political reasons. In this vein, Anto offers a reframing of the latter, the seemingly individualized and isolated electrification efforts. President Suharto, during his 30-year regime, promoted rural electrification and accomplished this, as we heard, in 2 ways: expansion and linking up of the legacy infrastructure left by the Dutch colonists, and development of isolated systems in rural regions using off-grid diesel power plants. Anto explains that the scheme of seemingly dispersed electrification is, however, a second interconnected system, replete with virtual links. It was created by a single organization, unified by visible identifying logos, and achieved through planning, training, distribution of equipment and fuel, and through the celebration of installations. In key ways, this network is not Hughesian. There's no literal physical connection between the dispersed parts, and the failure of one diesel generator will not have cascading effects beyond the local area. But conceptually, description of a parallel, non-physical, interconnected system is important in 2 ways. First, it challenges historical researchers to think broadly about off-grid electrification. What was the virtual network that helped the remote village in, say, India know about, acquire, and maintain diesel generators? And for planners looking ahead, it should prompt questions about what kind of network will be needed to, say, replace isolated diesel generators with solar panels that will function over the long run. Thomas Hughes identified distinct styles of electrification in the 3 places he studied, and his student, Gabrielle Hecht, advanced the idea of styles in her own book, The Radiance of France, published in 1998. She coined the term technopolitics, which Anto also uses, to describe how a government adopted and adapted electrification to solidify national identity. Following World War II, with few energy resources of its own, France focused on nuclear generation to develop a uniquely French style of electrification that was modern, that reflected traditional French identity, and that placed the country at the forefront of technical innovation. In recent decades, scholars have similarly examined how post-colonial government leaders adopt and adapt technologies of electrification to legitimate new governments, as we've heard, establish national identity, in some cases unify a country of diverse regions and communities, and support economic and industrial development. Anto, as we've heard, elucidates this process in Indonesia. President Suharto explicitly identified electrification as a pathway to modernity, unity, and social equity. As we learned, Indonesia's distinct style of electrification was bifurcated into two systems, the physically interconnected one and the virtually interconnected one. Importantly, President Suharto kept his promises to bring electricity to rural regions. Compare Indonesia's story to that of Ghana, for example, and the building of the Akosombo Dam, which is told by Stefan Meischer. For Ghanaians, the dam was promoted as a symbol of nationhood, national unity, and modernity, and communities lying between the dam and urban and industrial centers were promised access to the dam's coming electrical wealth. Instead, communities behind the dam were displaced by the floodwaters, while the power lines bypassed many on the other side. By contrast, Suharto not only delivered electricity, he also timed it to occur during election seasons to maximize the visibility of his promise kept, and voters returned his party to office. Anto names this as patrimonial technopolitics. With this, Anto adds to the arsenal of analytical tools historians may use when investigating how governments and politicians deploy technologies to achieve myriad ideological and political goals. Once again, looking ahead, the significance of patrimonial technopolitics lies in how policymakers plan for distribution and adoption of renewables and low-carbon technologies. The Indonesian experience should encourage consideration of the political quid pro quos at stake and the tensions within and between governmental entities that might help or hinder an energy transition. PLN, Indonesia's state electrical company, and President Suharto together produced a somewhat ingenious approach to electrifying an archipelago. Three indigenous factors faced any entity seeking to electrify this country: the sheer number and geographic reach of its thousands of islands, I guess the number is still in dispute, access to abundant oil, and the relative isolation of many small villages and hamlets. By distributing standardized diesel power plants, the government addressed these factors, also accommodated their stated national goals, and achieved Suharto's political aims. There were indeed shortcomings. PLN skipped over villages, diesel plants are smelly, polluting, and unhealthy, and political goals were at odds with operational goals of economy and efficiency. But looking ahead, we should ask, does this approach position Indonesia in a unique way to transition more smoothly to a low emissions or no emissions future, in this case built on microgrids and nanogrids? Finally, I have to ask, what is it about electricity? In chapter 6, Anto zeroes in on this question. The chapter focuses on the rise and fall of the three rural cooperatives he mentioned. They were conceived in part to improve social justice in the country. We learn, however, that these cooperatives met with a variety of challenges that ultimately resulted in poor quality service, protests, vandalism, and bankruptcy. But, in Anto's words, quote, getting an affordable and reliable electricity, regardless of the source, was a form of social justice. While this is not a central point of his work, it's a striking observation. At the end of the day, the customer wants the lights to go on and stay on. Historians and policymakers alike should ask, what degrees of risk to health and environment, cost to the pocketbook, sacrifice of political ideals, or inconvenience and inefficiency in other economic endeavors are we willing to absorb in order to get that electricity? In conclusion, thank you, Anto, for sharing Indonesia's history through the lens of electrification, for offering new frames for continuing research on this topic across the world, and for challenging us to see how your insights apply to our collective plans for our electric future. And you have to promise to sign my book after this.
All right, thank you, Julie. Suzanne?
I'd like to start first by thanking Anto and of course the Buffett Institute here for inviting me to this event today. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be able to participate in this discussion and to give you my own little spin on what I particularly liked about this book. Now, there are a lot of themes that I could get into, but I'm going to actually narrow down onto one that we've already talked about a little bit here, which is this issue of social justice. And in particular, I want to start just by offering my very strong appreciation to Anto for attending to the ways that the technological and the material become entangled with ideas about social justice. I feel like this is the part of the book that I found particularly exciting, and it's certainly a topic that's kind of dear to my heart. I also think it's a topic that's really so core and central to Indonesia's modern history. This question, I think, has been very consequential. The questions of justice have been really consequential in the scholarship. As Anto discussed, there is a way that modern discussions of justice are somehow rooted in colonial past and specifically in anti-colonial movements. And yet, as I think he shows, it's also true that they're not limited to that. When we look at the ways that Indonesians have debated or negotiated, either quietly or loudly, problems of justice, they've taken on kind of new lives as time goes by. And certainly, I would say that justice is a pretty messy business, not least because the term can be appropriated by anyone and its meaning can be contested over and over. So Indonesia's history of activism or activity on behalf of different visions of social justice is certainly a key kind of focus in the history, and particularly the history of the New Order. Many scholars have taken on questions like how do movements on behalf of social justice, how do they help create a new kind of civil society in Indonesia during the New Order, really in the face of extreme political limitations? It's certainly an important theme in thinking about the ultimate fall of authoritarianism. So for me, one of the interesting questions about social justice and ideas about social justice is if we assume that it's not just the great and the powerful that get to have some say about this, trying to understand how other people in society think through problems of social justice is an interesting question. So what Electrifying Indonesia does that is, for me, is so consequential is it allows us to really think about the role that the material, and specifically the technological and infrastructural, played in defining, negotiating, and implementing particular visions of justice. So we get to really think about here the ways that justice is constructed by different actors from the top political offices, but also including middle managers, engineers, and even to some degree, the ordinary peoples whose lives were touched by electrification projects. The very desired, or in some cases aspirational, ubiquity of electrification, which was overtly, as we saw, portrayed as a tool for a still very nebulously defined justice, created an environment where people could negotiate what justice means, what it really looks like, whether it's there or not. And I think this comes out really strongly in the book. And of course, I'd add, to emphasize a sort of foundational point from science and technology studies, the work of building meaning in technology is never separated from the work of building the technology itself. So this isn't a story simply of people getting electricity and interpreting it. This is really a story about the mutual construction of electrical technologies and, among other things, ideas about justice in Indonesia. So electricity infrastructures, as I'm going to try to argue here, having once been assigned a meaning, however cynically, as a tool of justice, then can become an important site, as I say, for disputing what justice is or what it should be. And so I wanted to talk about this theme in a little bit more of a concrete way by going back to the episodes that Anto was talking about, with the PLN working to electrify the rural regions outside of Java. As he demonstrates, the PLN was assigned a nearly impossible dual mission to spread the benefits of electrification across the entire archipelago, which, as Julie points out, is a non-trivial endeavor. That's the social mission, but also to operate as a viable profit-making enterprise. These two aims were frequently incompatible. Rural users were expensive to reach, but yielded little in the way of profits to offset those costs. Yet the social mission was never negotiable, again, for the reasons that Anto explains, because it was a vehicle for Suharto's patrimonial technopolitics. And like Julie, I also think that that term is a wonderful addition to our arsenal for thinking and analyzing about socio-technical systems. So, the electrification proceeded in rural areas as a kind of, bribe, let's face it, for the politics of peace and quiet that Suharto valued over law and order. And it was supposed to improve and provide physical evidence of the prosperity and justice that Suharto was claiming to be the New Order's gift to the Indonesian people. But if we just look at that story, a lot of what we first notice is that there's an awful lot of justice not accomplished. There are, as we say, great social differences among the people who have access and who don't. It's a highly transactional kind of thing, which already, I'll leave it to the philosophers to explain this better, but something that transactional does not feel like a great example of social justice in its process, shall we say. And I do feel like there is never any explanation from the top about what precisely that justice is. It's a highly and easy to corrupt enterprise, and it was corrupted fairly often. And again, that just for anybody who knows what's going on, that also creates some challenges for thinking about this as a place of justice. So by pointing all of this out, I just want to say, a funny thing happens on the way to the infrastructure, which is as the agents of the PLN themselves were indoctrinated into Suharto's fairly petrified version of Pancasila, they are still in the have to take on the job of actually fulfilling those promises to some degree in a material form. And that means that they themselves have to kind of grapple with this question of what justice is. And so I felt that it was really noticeable in this book that when we were talking about social justice in these projects, you never heard a definition or questioning of what that is until you start listening to what the middle managers have to say, what the electrical engineers have to say. So they're the ones that have the most interesting things to say about what justice is or what it maybe isn't, even though we thought it was. So they refer to justice as equity or equity of access, but then that kind of raises some questions. Well, is just being able to watch TV enough? Is it really equitable when only some people in the village can actually access this on a regular basis? I mean, what kind of equity were they really producing? The failure of that access also to translate into visible and maybe sustained local economic growth, or we might call that opportunity, was concerning to them. Had they really met their aims or not? So regardless of whether, as Anto points out, that by the time Suharto's New Order is over, not too many people are very enthusiastic about the Pancasila idea because of the way it had been, pushed on them. And yet you have people who in their own day-to-day way are taking the idea that Indonesia should be a nation, a just nation. They take it pretty seriously. So the failure, these kind of failures they encounter create problems that challenge them to think a little bit more about what needs to happen. You know, what about those low quality, it turns out, diesel installations, the ones that were installed at very high speed in order to guarantee votes for Golkar, but which didn't necessarily guarantee, regular access to electricity. So the engineers' disquiet about the technical weaknesses of their project speaks to a dissatisfaction that at least I read as not merely self-interested concern about their reputation or their technical prowess. There really feels to me to be a questioning about whether they were indeed spreading prosperity and justice, and maybe if not, how they might be able to do that a little bit better. So, I use this point to kind of say that one way to interpret all that's going on here is that the very act of implementing this project, of building the technology and instantiating what was, in my view, at least a purposely vaguely defined measure of prosperity and justice, gave these engineers actually a resource for thinking in a day-to-day way about what a just nation looks like, at least in part. So once built, in whatever form it was built, the very visibility of the electricity infrastructure and its continued association with claims about justice means that its forms of working, its embeddedness in society, those all become resources for questioning and maybe rethinking what justice can be. Now, I want to highlight, of course, that the story of justice that I'm telling you here, and certainly the story that Anto gives us, is not a romanticized story in the slightest. This is not a story where the users of electricity were extraordinarily empowered to speak truth to the new order. I would say that did not happen. They are portrayed as being at least somewhat co-opted into the patrimonial technopolitics. Certainly they did receive something from that they did value. PLN itself continued to find the contradictions between its social and economic missions difficult and frankly undesirable. And Indonesians, as much as the rest of us, continue to negotiate and dispute what justice means, how much is available to Indonesia, to individuals and the nation. And I doubt that they will stop debating these things anytime soon. But what I wanted to highlight about all of this and this particular story, as much as electricity is actually a rather magnificent and not everyday kind of technology, there's something about the kind of way that ordinary people can engage with this technology in a number of different ways, and then take what was meant to be just sort of a blanket claim about justice and what justice means in Indonesia, and be able to think with the electricity about what they actually want to have in their society. And I do think that the fact that this is a technological site for thinking about this really matters. Because it's the kind of thing that people encounter in physical ways that comes to matter to them and importantly in their lives, and it gives them resources that they didn't have. So even if the kind of discussions about social justice here are a little bit subtle and maybe even a little bit mundane, I would argue that they're important for filling in more of the picture about how Indonesians have attempted to construct a just nation. So let me conclude here by simply mentioning that there's a lot else in this book that I would love to talk about. But I really hope that those of you who haven't had a chance to read it will do so soon, because I quite enjoyed it and I recommend it highly. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you very much, Julie and Suzanne, and thank you as well, Anto. Anto, we'll start with a question for you. Suzanne's comments put me in mind of a couple of things that Isaiah Berlin said. One is borrowing from Kant, that from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. And we get that sense of social justice following a winding path in Indonesia. The other thing that Isaiah Berlin said is that very often the solutions that one generation will implement to the problems that they face will pose the problems the next generation is trying to solve. So in your work, you are showing us a fascinating way in which technology intersects with values, with post-colonialism, with nation building, with social justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those things are viewed now in relation to the project of electrification? How successfully do people feel that those values have been realized, and what work remains to be done?
Thank you, Baron. That's actually really excellent questions. In the post-New Order era, the idea of social justice, however contentious it can be, however vague it can be, still animate not just PLN employees, actually many Indonesian citizens to try and achieve what they think should be a just nation, as Suzanne eloquently elaborated earlier. So, for example, there are many villages that were neglected during the Suharto era that did not get electricity when the virtue of their location. Villages in the borderland areas. Indonesia borders 10 nations in Southeast Asia, both at the sea and also on land. But, Suharto government didn't think that those villages necessarily need to be electrified because they were deemed to be unimportant for the regime, at least to gain electoral support. But in the post-New Order era, many Indonesian citizens were able to shape the thinking of the Indonesian government and also PLN employees to start focusing on those areas. Okay. You want to talk about social justice for all Indonesians? Well, how come these villages on the borderlands and also on remote locations up in a mountain or on one island somewhere or in barren province, for example, right? They're still not electrified yet, okay? Well, we need to do so. And that concerted effort was carried out starting from the first term administrations of the current president, President Joko, in 2014. So there was a shift in the thinking of how to achieve social justice and also to maintain Indonesia's territorial integrity. Okay? We need to take care of this borderland areas. We need to deliver electricity. However, we need to do so, including purchasing cross-border electricity. So it still very much animates PLN employees and many Indonesian citizens, and they've been participating more and more in the saying or policies of electrification through various means, through associations, to articles in the newspapers, magazines, and so forth.
Great, thank you. Now, Julie, in her remarks, Suzanne said something like, the work of building meaning is never separated from the work of building technology. And presumably something like that is also going to be true for the work of rebuilding or reconfiguring technology. So you noted in your remarks that Indonesia, in some places, followed an approach of having many small or local power grids, and that might position it well at a time when the demands of climate change and decarbonization are becoming ever more pressing. Can you say a little bit more about this? What kinds of new meaning could Indonesia bring to electrification, and by extension, the larger aims of nation building and social justice?
Thank you, Baron. Is this working properly? Okay, good. Let me take a step back and paint a quick picture of some of the options people talk about for how we go through this energy transition that seems to be foremost in the news these days. Some imagine a macro process. We build giant wind farms, solar farms, giant new transmission lines that connect them all up, even around the globe. At the other end of the extreme is the nanogrid, a solar panel a backup battery, and maybe keep that old diesel generator in the garage with a can of fuel so that you can be completely off the grid. And then all kinds of variations in between, including ones where we keep our giant grid, but we make it possible to easily break it up into small bits and pieces to keep things going when there's a power outage. It struck me that the approach of electrification that really ignored the need to hook everything up was ideal if, in fact, Indonesia wants to move toward a net zero future, because the blueprint is already there for how you get the equipment around, maybe not so well about how you keep it working, nor necessarily who gets it first. These are the issues of social justice that are at stake and continuity and maintenance that are at stake. But if in fact that is a future that is imagined in that country, it creates the opportunity for that country to really be the path breaker, to show the rest of the world, or at least those interested in microgrids, nanogrids, isolating pieces of a grid, that it can be done, how it can be done, and in a way that adheres to goals of a net zero or low carbon future. It doesn't necessarily inherently add meaning or solve social justice problems in any way. It just creates yet another iteration of a path that was followed previously, and perhaps, depending on the governance, the social choices, an opportunity to achieve those ideals more successfully.
Thank you, Julie. Suzanne, you focused on the theme of social justice in Anto's book, and I'm going to play dirty by asking you a very big question here, by asking you to expand on how this connects with your work more broadly on the history of technology in Southeast Asia. Now, this is often a matter of adapting or adopting technologies that were created elsewhere for use in a different sort of context. As we see newer forms of technology come online, like internet access and access to social media and the like, how is that going to play out with the role of social justice, or the place of social justice in making these decisions? And what lessons can we draw from how Indonesia might connect with the rest of the world in this way?
Thank you. That is a really hard question. But I'll suggest a couple of things. In having the opportunity to kind of trace out a longue durée history of technology in Southeast Asia, you know, the one big picture that you get about a lot of Southeast Asia, but certainly Indonesia, is that the kind of connectedness is just an ongoing theme, and it always comes with these sort of challenges that people have to kind of negotiate across borders to think about how technical relationships are going to work out, and sometimes that negotiation can be a little violent. Well, hopefully we won't be seeing as much of that in the future, but who knows? But I would say that, you know, in the modern context, I mean, Indonesia in particular has, in a broader way, always attempted to position itself in Southeast Asia in particular as kind of a mediator in the region. And if you look at some of the things that like ASEAN has done in order to try to come to certain kinds of agreements with just most of what I think about these days is agriculture. So some agricultural things, but in other areas of climate change policies in general, I feel like it does raise a lot of questions about what social justice means, because it's no longer a national project, and it's certainly not a regional project. I mean, regional, and like, it's not a small regional project. It operates at all of these different scales. And I think technologies that likewise operate at all of these different scales have the capacity for doing a lot of for undoing a lot of things that probably shouldn't be undone, but then also, again, in the same way, become opportunities for people to step up and really think about social justice in a broader way. I do feel like in Indonesia's case, they've focused so much on the nation, and when we think about what's going on in the modern context, Indonesia is a modern state. the outward look is much more pronounced, I think, now than maybe even 30 years ago. It's a little vague, but maybe there's more.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. I saw over here first.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. The presentation portrayed the electrification of private households in the rural spaces. I'd like to know, like, how did the national government electrify industrial factories in both urban and rural spaces? Did the speed of electrification for industrial sector same as the private household or different? Did the government prioritize private household electrification more than industrial sectors or other workplaces? How did they consider places like schools or hospitals, some other public spaces?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The New Order government prioritized electrifying urban areas first, both for households and factories and buildings, whatever that need to be electrified in those towns and cities. And then slowly it spread to the countryside. So if there was a factory designed and constructed in the rural areas, it would receive electricity at around the same time when that region finally get electrified. So it wasn't prioritized, oh, we need to electrify factories first and then households. No, but more like where where the densely populated areas were at the time, and slowly from there separate from the more sparsely populated areas.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I was a Peace Corps planner in Malawi in the early 1990s. And the infrastructure that we had in Malawi was what the British put in. It was not a priority to the life president. And I mean, you look at this in hindsight and you say, well, was there social justice? The way I see it is it was nation building. I mean, they're on islands. How would they know each other? But more because they were able to get, if you choose that more than anything else, they have electricity, they get communication infrastructure. And I think that's enormously important because one thing I noticed in a place that had no communication, all your information was from rumor and nothing ever got done.
Well, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, the Dutch managed to electrify many big cities and towns in Java, including the city called Bandung. You may have heard of this. And that allowed the Sukarno government to hold the Asia-Africa conference in 1955 because it was, well electrified at that time.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you will stay to connect with each other outside the doors of our room here, where we have a reception with wine and light refreshments. And please join me in thanking Anto Mohsin, our author, and Suzanne Moon and Julie Cohn, our speakers.